Lady Eliza stood trembling before the Duke's study door, her hand raised to knock, knowing that what she was about to ask would either save her or destroy the fragile arrangement between them. Inside, the man who had offered her shelter but nothing more was about to discover the one truth she'd sworn to keep hidden, that she'd fallen hopelessly in love with him. And when he finally looked at her with those storm-grey eyes, when his hand reached out to touch her face for the very first time, everything they'd both promised, the distance, the boundaries, the careful indifference would shatter with a single forbidden kiss. But to understand how they arrived at this moment, we must go back 3 months, to the day Eliza became the unwanted bride of the coldest duke in England. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a stern-faced solicitor who smelled of tobacco and old paper. Eliza had read it 3 times before the words finally made sense, before the reality of her situation crashed down upon her like a wave she couldn't escape. Her father was dead. The man who had raised her, taught her to read, encouraged her curiosity about the world, gone. And worse, he'd left her with nothing. Less than nothing, actually. There were debts. Significant debts that creditors were already demanding she pay. The small townhouse where she'd lived her entire life would be seized within the month. Her modest inheritance, already spent by her father on bad investments and worse luck. She was 23 years old, unmarried, and about to be completely destitute. Eliza had spent that first week in a fog of grief and growing panic. She wrote to distant relatives, received polite refusals in return. No one wanted the burden of a penniless young woman with no prospects and no connections worth mentioning. She considered becoming a governess, but even those positions required references she didn't have. A lady's companion, perhaps, but the advertisements all asked for women with experience, with skills she'd never needed to develop. Her father had always assured her she'd be taken care of, that he had plans, that everything would work out. He'd been wrong. Then the second letter arrived. This one was different. Heavy cream paper sealed with an unfamiliar crest, written in precise, almost cold handwriting. It was from a solicitor representing Duke James Howard of Thornfield Manor. The Duke, the letter explained, found himself in need of a wife. Not for romantic reasons, the letter was careful to clarify, but for practical ones. His family had been pressing him to marry for years. There were social obligations that required a duchess at his side, estate matters that needed a woman's presence, the continuation of the family line to consider. He was prepared to offer a substantial sum to settle her father's debts, provide her with security and a home, and ask nothing in return except her name and her presence when society demanded it. The letter continued in that same cold, business-like tone. The Duke wished to be perfectly clear about the nature of this arrangement. This would not be a love match. He expected separate quarters, separate lives lived under the same roof. She would have access to his library, his grounds, and a generous allowance for her personal needs. In exchange, she would appear at his side when necessary, maintain the household and otherwise keep to herself. It was, in essence, a business transaction. Shelter and security in exchange for the appearance of a normal marriage. The letter ended with a single line that somehow felt colder than all the rest. Do not expect affection. I have none to give. Eliza had read that letter a dozen times, her hands shaking more with each reading. It was the most unromantic, clinical proposal of marriage she could have imagined. No mention of companionship, of partnership, of even basic kindness. Just an exchange of services, as impersonal as hiring a housekeeper. But what choice did she have? The creditors were already knocking at her door. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to, no other options presenting themselves. At least this way she'd survive. At least she'd have a roof over her head and food on her table. It was more than many women in her position could hope for. She'd written back her acceptance that same day, her pen scratching across the paper with words that felt like signing away her life. 3 weeks later, she found herself standing in a London chapel, wearing a simple dress she'd owned for years, waiting for a man she'd never met to become her husband. The Duke arrived exactly on time, tall and imposing in black, his face a mask of polite indifference. He was handsome, she noticed with some surprise. Dark hair, strong features, those grey eyes that seemed to look through her rather than at her. But there was something hollow about him, something absent, as if he were performing the motions of life without actually living. The ceremony lasted less than 15 minutes. He spoke his vows in a flat, emotionless voice. He didn't look at her once during the entire service, his eyes fixed somewhere over her shoulder, as if she weren't really there at all. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, the Duke gave the briefest nod, placed a cold gold band on her finger without meeting her eyes, and immediately turned to sign the register. There was no kiss, no smile, no acknowledgement that anything significant had just occurred. Just a legal formality completed, a box checked on some invisible list of obligations he was methodically working through. They travelled to Thornfield Manor in separate carriages. Eliza watched through the window as the London streets gave way to countryside, then to increasingly wild and desolate landscape. The manor, when it finally appeared through the mist, looked exactly as cold and unwelcoming as its owner. Grey stone, tall windows that reflected nothing but grey sky, surrounded by leafless trees that seemed to reach toward the building like skeletal fingers. It looked less like a home and more like a mausoleum, a place where things went to die rather than live. Mrs. Holloway, the housekeeper, met her at the entrance with a kind smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The woman was perhaps 60, with silver hair and a face that had seen much but said little. She showed Eliza through endless corridors, past portraits of stern-faced Howards, who seemed to judge her with their painted eyes, to a suite of rooms in the East Wing. "His Grace thought you'd be comfortable here," Mrs. Holloway said carefully, and Eliza understood immediately what wasn't being said. These rooms were as far from the Duke's chambers as possible, while still being in the same building. The rooms were beautiful in an impersonal way, expensive furniture, thick carpets, windows overlooking gardens that looked as if no one had tended them in years. But they felt empty, unlived in, like a hotel room rather than a home. Mrs. Holloway explained the household schedule in a gentle voice. The Duke took breakfast at 7, so Eliza should plan for 8. He used the library from 9 until 11, and again from 7 until 9 in the evening, so she should avoid those hours. Dinner would be served in her rooms unless there were guests, in which case she would be notified in advance. His Grace valued his privacy and his solitude above all things. It would be best if she respected that. After Mrs. Holloway left, Eliza sat on the edge of the enormous bed and finally let herself feel the full weight of what she'd done. She'd married a stranger who didn't want her. She was living in a house that felt like a tomb. She had security, yes, and shelter, but at what cost? She was 23 years old, and her life was essentially over before it had really begun. That night, lying alone in that big bed in that empty room, she cried quietly into her pillow, mourning not just her father, but the future she'd imagined for herself, the husband who might have loved her, the children she might have had, the home that might have been filled with warmth instead of this terrible, echoing silence. And then, just as she was finally drifting into exhausted sleep, she heard it. A sound that made her freeze, her breath catching in her throat. It came from somewhere deep within the manor, echoing through the corridors like something out of a nightmare. A man's voice crying out in anguish, wordless and raw, the sound of someone in profound pain. It lasted only a moment before cutting off abruptly, leaving behind a silence somehow more disturbing than the cry itself. Eliza lay there in the darkness, her heart pounding, wondering what kind of man made sounds like that in the night, wondering what torment haunted the Duke of Howard, and wondering, with a chill that had nothing to do with the cold room, what she'd truly gotten herself into. The first week at Thornfield Manor passed in a strange blur of loneliness and growing curiosity. Eliza moved through the vast house like a ghost, careful to observe all the rules Mrs. Holloway had outlined, careful to avoid the Duke during his designated hours, careful not to disturb the oppressive quiet that seemed to hang over everything like a shroud. She saw him only in passing, a tall figure disappearing around a corner, a shadow moving past a window, the sound of a door closing somewhere in the distance. He never acknowledged her presence, never spoke to her, never even looked in her direction. It was as if she didn't exist at all. But Eliza was observant by nature, and even in her careful avoidance she began to notice things. The way the servants moved through the house with hushed voices and worried glances. The way certain rooms remained perpetually closed, dust gathering on their handles. The way fresh flowers appeared every week on a table in the portrait gallery, always placed before the same painting. A beautiful young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. And most disturbing of all, those sounds in the night. They came irregularly, sometimes several nights in a row, sometimes not at all for days. But when they came, they were always the same, that terrible cry of anguish, cutting through the darkness like a knife. On the 5th day, Eliza found herself in the kitchen mid-morning, having gotten lost trying to find the conservatory Mrs. Holloway had mentioned. She was about to announce herself when she heard voices, the cook and 2 maids, speaking in those hushed tones people use when discussing something they shouldn't. She knew she should make her presence known, knew that eavesdropping was beneath her. But something made her pause in the doorway, hidden from view, and listen. 2 years come November, the cook was saying, her voice heavy with sadness. 2 years since Miss Eliza died, and he's still locked away in his grief. It's not natural, I tell you. A man shouldn't mourn like that. One of the maids responded, younger, her voice curious. My mum worked here before when his Grace was young. She says he was different then. Always laughing, always kind to everyone. Miss Eliza did that to him, brought out the best in him. They were so in love everyone could see it. The cook sighed deeply, which makes it all the worse what happened that terrible night. The roads were icy, the storm was raging, and he'd sent for her. Wanted her to come to him, rather than going to her like he should have. The carriage overturned on the way here. They found her in the morning, frozen in the snow. Dead instantly, the doctor said, though who knows if that was kindness or truth. The second maid's voice dropped to barely a whisper. They say he was the one who found her. Went out looking when she didn't arrive. Can you imagine finding the woman you love like that? Knowing you're the reason she was on that road in the first place? He's never forgiven himself, the first maid said. Never will by the looks of it. Built walls around his heart so thick, nothing and no one can get through. Won't let himself feel anything. Won't let anyone close. Afraid if he cares about someone, they'll die too. Poor man's as good as dead himself, just still walking around. The cook made a disapproving sound. And now he's gone and married that poor girl, Lady Eliza. Brought her here to live in those empty rooms, expecting nothing from her, giving nothing to her. It's not right. She deserves better than to be a ghost in her own home. Eliza pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding. Everything suddenly made terrible sense. The coldness, the distance, the lifeless quality she'd sensed in him. He wasn't cruel, he was broken, shattered by grief and guilt, trapped in a prison of his own making. He'd married her out of obligation, but he couldn't bear to let her close because closeness meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant the possibility of loss. He was protecting himself the only way he knew how, by feeling nothing, wanting nothing, connecting with no one. She slipped away from the kitchen before the servants could discover her, her mind reeling with this new understanding. That afternoon, she found herself drawn to the portrait gallery, standing before the painting that received those weekly flowers. Elara Ashworth, the nameplate read. So this was her, the Duke's lost love, forever young and beautiful, forever frozen in time. She had gentle eyes, Eliza noticed, and a smile that suggested kindness and warmth. The kind of woman who would have brought light into dark places, who would have made a cold manor feel like home. The kind of woman James Howard had loved with his whole heart, and whose death had destroyed him. Over the following days, Eliza found herself watching the Duke more carefully, though always from a distance, always respecting the boundaries he'd so clearly established. She saw him standing at the cemetery gates one misty morning, his shoulders bowed, his head lowered, utterly still for nearly an hour. She glimpsed him through the study window late at night, still dressed, still working as if sleep was something he avoided rather than sought. She noticed how he never smiled, how he moved through life with mechanical precision, performing tasks without any apparent feeling or engagement. He was, she realized, exactly what the cook had said, a man who was technically alive but not really living. It was on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, exactly 2 weeks after her arrival, that their paths truly crossed for the first time. Eliza had been exploring the library during what she thought were safe hours, having miscalculated the time while absorbed in a volume of Wordsworth's poetry. She was curled in a leather chair near the window, completely lost in the verses, when she heard the door open behind her. She looked up to find the Duke standing in the doorway, his expression shifting from surprise to something harder when he saw her. "Lady Howard," he said, his voice flat and cold. "This is my time." It wasn't angry exactly, but it carried an unmistakable dismissal. Eliza jumped to her feet immediately, the book tumbling from her lap. I'm so sorry, Your Grace, I lost track of time. I'll leave immediately. She bent to gather the fallen book and several others she'd pulled from the shelves, her hands shaking slightly. She'd broken the rules, invaded his space, disrupted his carefully ordered world. She felt like a child caught somewhere she shouldn't be. But then something unexpected happened. The Duke stepped forward, and at the same moment Eliza reached for the Wordsworth volume, his hand was already there. Their fingers touched on the leather binding, just a brief contact, barely a second, but it was the first time they'd touched since he'd placed the ring on her finger at their wedding. Eliza froze, her eyes meeting his for the first time since that day. Up close, his eyes were even more striking than she'd realized. Grey like storm clouds framed by dark lashes and filled with such emptiness it made her chest ache. For a moment neither of them moved. The air between them felt charged somehow, heavy with something unspoken. Then the Duke pulled his hand back as if he'd been burned, taking a small step backward. But his eyes had dropped to the book between them, and something flickered across his face. Recognition, perhaps, or memory, or pain. "Wordsworth," he said, and his voice had changed slightly, had lost some of that flat coldness. "You read poetry?" It wasn't quite a question, more an observation that seemed to surprise him. "Yes," Eliza said quietly, still holding the book. I find comfort in it," in his words. "The way he writes about nature and memory and—" She trailed off, suddenly aware she was saying too much, revealing too much. The Duke was staring at the book now, not at her, and she could see tension in his jaw, in the way his hands had curled into fists at his sides. "Lara loved Wordsworth," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Then, as if realizing he'd revealed something he shouldn't have, he cleared his throat and his expression hardened again. "I apologize for the intrusion." "You were here first." "No, please," Eliza said quickly. "This is your library, your house, your time. I was the one who intruded." "I'll go." She started gathering the rest of her books, preparing to flee, but his voice stopped her. "Wait." She looked up, surprised. He was standing very still, clearly struggling with something internal, some decision he was trying to make. Finally he spoke again, the words seeming to cost him effort. "You may stay, if you wish. Just be quiet." Eliza's breath caught. It was such a small concession, barely anything at all, really. But from a man who'd spent 2 weeks avoiding her completely, who'd built his entire life around isolation and distance, it felt monumental. "Thank you," she said softly and settled back into her chair. The Duke moved to his desk near the window, as far from her as the room allowed, and opened a ledger. Beginning to work in silence, they stayed like that for over an hour, neither speaking, neither acknowledging the other directly, but both acutely aware of the other's presence. Eliza tried to focus on her poetry, but found her attention constantly drifting to the man across the room. She noticed how he rubbed his temples occasionally, as if fighting a headache, how his handwriting was precise and controlled, like everything else about him, how he seemed to radiate tension, as if merely existing required enormous effort, and she wondered what it would take to reach him, to crack through those walls he'd built so carefully around himself. When she finally rose to leave, gathering her books quietly, she paused at the door. "Your Grace?" He looked up, his expression guarded. "Thank you for letting me stay." He gave the briefest nod, already looking back down at his work, dismissing her. But as Eliza walked back to her lonely rooms, her heart was beating faster than usual. Something had shifted, something small but significant. He'd let her stay. He'd spoken Ilara's name in her presence. He'd allowed a crack, however tiny, to appear in his armor. That night she found a stack of books outside her door. 5 volumes of poetry, Wordsworth, Keats, Shelley, Byron, and Tennyson. There was no note, no explanation, but she knew who had left them. She carried them inside with trembling hands, pressing one to her chest. It was such a small gesture, really, just some books, but from a man who gave nothing, who wanted nothing, who'd shut himself off from all human connection. It felt like something precious, like the first green shoot pushing through frozen ground, promising that spring might someday come, even to the coldest, most barren places. The library encounters became routine over the following weeks, a pattern neither of them acknowledged, but both clearly anticipated. Eliza would arrive during his hours, settling into her chair by the window, with whatever book he'd left outside her door the night before. The Duke would enter shortly after, moving to his desk without a word, and they would spend hours in companionable silence. It wasn't much, they rarely spoke more than a few polite words, but it was something. A shared space, a quiet understanding, a small crack in the wall of isolation that had surrounded them both. The books kept appearing outside her door. Sometimes poetry, sometimes philosophy, occasionally novels he thought she might enjoy. She began leaving small notes of thanks tucked into the returned volumes, simple messages like, "This moved me to tears. Thank you, or your taste is impeccable." He never responded to the notes directly, but the books kept coming, each one carefully selected, each one somehow perfect for her mood or interests. The servants noticed, of course. Mrs. Holloway began smiling more, humming softly as she went about her duties. The maids whispered about how his grace seemed slightly less remote, how the household felt fractionally less like a tomb. Then came the storm. It arrived near midnight on a Tuesday in late autumn, announcing itself with thunder that shook the old manor's foundations. Eliza woke to lightning illuminating her room in stark flashes, rain hammering against the windows with violence that made the glass rattle. She sat up in bed, her heart already racing, memories flooding back unbidden. Her father's death had come on a night like this, thunder and lightning and her holding his hand as his heart finally gave out. His last words lost in the sound of rain. She tried to calm herself, taking deep breaths, reminding herself she was safe. But then the lightning struck closer, the thunder following almost immediately, and the lights went out completely. Plunged into absolute darkness, except for those terrible flashes of lightning, Eliza felt panic rising in her chest. She fumbled for the candle on her bedside table, her hands shaking so badly she nearly knocked it over. Finally getting it lit, she wrapped herself in a robe and stepped into the hallway, thinking perhaps she'd feel safer near other people, near any sign of life in this enormous dark house. But the hallway was just as dark, just as empty, and the thunder was even louder out here, echoing through the corridors like the manor itself was crying out. Eliza moved forward, not sure where she was going, just knowing she couldn't stay alone in that room. She'd barely gone 20 steps when a particularly violent crack of thunder made her gasp and drop the candle. It rolled away, the flame extinguishing, leaving her in complete blackness. She heard herself make a small, frightened sound, pressing her back against the wall, trying to breathe through the panic that was threatening to overwhelm her. Then, cutting through the darkness and her fear, a voice. "Eliza!" It was the first time he'd used her given name, the first time he'd addressed her with anything other than formal distance. She saw lantern light approaching, and then James was there, his face concerned in the flickering glow. "You're afraid of storms," he said. Not a question, an observation. She nodded, not trusting her voice, embarrassed by her weakness but unable to hide it. He studied her for a moment, something shifting in his expression. Then he made a decision. "Come with me," he said quietly. "My study has a fire. You'll be warmer there." He didn't wait for her answer, just turned and began walking, clearly expecting her to follow. Eliza did, staying close to his lantern light, grateful beyond words that she wasn't alone anymore. His private study was exactly as she'd imagined, lined with books, a fire blazing in the hearth, leather chairs worn comfortable with use. It was the warmest room she'd encountered in Thornfield Manor, and not just because of the fire. It felt lived in, personal, real. James gestured to a chair near the fire and disappeared briefly, returning with a thick blanket that he draped around her shoulders without ceremony. Then he moved to a small table and began preparing tea, his movements practiced and sure. "You don't have to explain," he said as he worked, his back to her. "Everyone has their fears." Eliza pulled the blanket tighter around herself, watching him. This was the most attention he'd paid her since their wedding, the most care he'd shown. It felt surreal sitting in his private sanctuary, watching him make tea for her with his own hands. When he brought her the cup, their fingers brushed again, and this time neither of them pulled away quite as quickly. "My father died during a storm," she found herself saying. "I was with him, holding his hand. The thunder was so loud, and I couldn't hear what he was trying to tell me at the end. I've hated storms ever since." James settled into the chair across from her, his own cup cradled in his hands. "Ilara died on a night like this," he said quietly, staring into the fire. The storm had made the roads dangerous, ice everywhere. Her carriage overturned. "They said she died instantly, but I—" He stopped, his jaw clenching. "You blame yourself," Eliza said softly. It wasn't a question. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and the pain in his eyes was so raw it took her breath away. I sent for her, asked her to come to me rather than going to her myself. If I hadn't been so selfish, so impatient, she'd still be alive. His voice was rough with barely suppressed emotion. I killed her with my selfishness. No, Eliza said firmly. An accident killed her. A tragedy. You couldn't have known what would happen. He shook his head. That's what everyone says. But knowing doesn't help. The guilt... He trailed off, looking back at the fire. They sat in silence for a long moment, the storm raging outside but somehow distant now, muted by the warmth and unexpected intimacy of this shared space. Guilt is a prison we build ourselves, Eliza said quietly. But we hold the key to our own cells. He looked at her sharply, something flickering in his expression. And if we don't know how to turn that key? His voice was barely audible. Maybe, she said carefully, we don't have to do it alone. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Outside, the storm began to ease, thunder growing more distant. But neither of them moved. They talked through the rest of the night, carefully at first, then more freely. About loss and loneliness, about the weight of surviving when others don't, about how exhausting it is to carry grief alone. As dawn began to break, painting the sky in shades of grey and pink, Eliza felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. Not quite happiness, but perhaps the possibility of it. When she finally rose to leave, James stood as well. Eliza, he said, and she turned at the door. Perhaps we could... That is, would you consider taking breakfast with me tomorrow morning? Her heart leapt. I'd like that very much, she managed to say. As she walked back to her rooms, the borrowed blanket still around her shoulders, she felt that something fundamental had shifted between them. The wall hadn't come down, but a door had opened. And on the other side, she'd glimpsed the man he'd been before grief had frozen him, and the man he might become again. Breakfast together became their new routine, and with it came a transformation neither had expected. The formal distance that had defined their first month of marriage began to dissolve, replaced by something tentative and fragile, but undeniably real. James, she'd started thinking of him by his first name now, though she still called him Your Grace aloud, proved to have a dry wit that caught her off guard and made her laugh in ways she hadn't since her father died. And when she laughed, something in his face would soften, his grey eyes warming for just a moment before he caught himself and looked away. Their conversations deepened beyond polite small talk. He told her about the estate, his responsibilities, the tenants he genuinely cared about even if he pretended not to. She shared her love of literature, her thoughts on philosophy, the dreams she'd once had before circumstances forced her into this arrangement. He listened when she spoke, truly listened, in a way that made her feel seen for the first time in months, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the physical distance between them began to shrink. It started with the garden walks. One morning after breakfast, James had paused at the door and asked, almost awkwardly, if she'd care to walk with him through the grounds. Eliza had agreed immediately, her heart beating faster than it should. They'd walked the gravel paths in comfortable silence at first, autumn leaves crunching beneath their feet, the morning air crisp and clean. He pointed out various features of the estate, the folly his grandfather had built, the orchard that produced the best apples in the county, the old oak tree he'd climbed as a boy. I broke my arm falling from that branch there, he said, gesturing upward. I was 10, and convinced I could reach the bird's nest at the top. My father was furious, but my mother just laughed while setting the bone. It was the first time Eliza had heard him speak of his childhood, the first glimpse of the boy he'd been before life, had taught him to guard his heart so carefully. Were you close to your mother? She asked gently. A shadow crossed his face. She died when I was 15. Fever took her in less than a week. After that, it was just my father and me, and we were never... He trailed off, but she understood. More loss, more walls built brick by painful brick. The walks became daily occurrences, and gradually they walked closer together. One morning, when the path was muddy from recent rain, James offered his arm. The ground is uneven, he said, as if that explained everything. Eliza took it, feeling the warmth of him through the fabric of his coat, acutely aware of every point where their bodies touched. She expected him to withdraw once they reached smoother ground, but his arm stayed extended, and her hand stayed tucked in the crook of his elbow for the entire walk. Neither mentioned it, but the next morning he offered his arm again without any excuse about uneven ground. Their library time evolved as well. They no longer sat on opposite sides of the room, but shared the sofa near the fire, sitting close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him, close enough that their knees occasionally brushed, and neither moved away. Sometimes he would read passages aloud to her, poetry mostly, but also philosophy and even passages from novels he thought she'd enjoy. His voice when he read was different from his normal speaking voice, richer and warmer, and she found herself watching his face instead of following the words, noticing the way his expression softened when something in the text moved him. One evening, about 6 weeks into their marriage, they lingered over dinner in the dining room. James had insisted they move from opposite ends of the long table to adjacent corners, close enough to actually see each other's faces, to have real conversation. Wine had loosened both their tongues, and they talked about everything and nothing. Books they'd loved, places they'd like to travel, the absurdity of social conventions that dictated so much of their lives. "Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if circumstances had been different?" Eliza asked, emboldened by the wine and the intimacy of the candle-lit room. James considered this, his eyes on her face. "Every day," he admitted quietly. "I wonder what kind of man I would have been if I hadn't lost so much. If grief hadn't—" He stopped, struggling with words. "If I hadn't let it define me." "You're more than your grief," Eliza said softly. "Oh, you've been kind to me, patient. That's not nothing, James." She'd used his first name without thinking, and his eyes widened slightly at the sound of it. "You think I'm kind?" he asked, something vulnerable in his voice. "I've kept you at arm's length for weeks. Given you nothing but cold politeness and a lonely room in an empty house. You've given me more than you think," she said. "Books chosen carefully for my taste. Conversation that challenges me. Walks where I don't feel so alone. Small kindnesses that matter more because they cost you something to give." He was staring at her now, with an intensity that made her breath catch. Without thinking, he reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. For a moment the world seemed to stop. Then he jerked his hand back as if burned, standing abruptly. "It's late," he said, his voice rough. "You should rest." He left before she could respond, practically fleeing the room. Eliza sat alone at the table, her hand touching her cheek where his fingers had been, her heart pounding. Something was happening between them, something neither had planned or expected. They were falling slowly but surely, despite every wall he'd built and every reason they had to keep their distance. And the terrifying, wonderful truth was that she didn't want to stop. The morning after James had touched her face and fled, everything changed. The warmth that had been slowly building between them vanished overnight, replaced by a cold formality that felt even worse than their initial arrangement. James stopped appearing at breakfast. The library remained conspicuously empty during their usual shared hours. When they passed in the corridors, he would give the briefest nod and hurry past, his expression closed and distant. The books stopped appearing outside her door. Eliza felt the loss of their growing connection like a physical ache. Had she misread everything? Had those moments of warmth and laughter and tentative closeness meant nothing to him? Or worse, had they meant something and that was exactly why he was running? She caught herself watching for him, hoping for even a glimpse, but he seemed determined to avoid her completely. It was as if the past weeks had never happened, as if they'd gone back to being strangers sharing a house. Except now it hurt infinitely more because she knew what she was missing. Mrs. Holloway noticed, of course. "His Grace is fighting himself, my lady," she said one afternoon, finding Eliza alone in the conservatory, staring out at the grey autumn landscape. Fighting what he feels. It terrifies him. Eliza turned to look at the housekeeper. "Why?" she asked, though she thought she knew the answer. "Because last time he let himself love someone, he lost her. The pain nearly destroyed him. He's convinced that caring leads to loss, that it's safer to feel nothing at all." Mrs. Holloway's expression was kind but sad. "But we can't choose not to feel, can we? We can only choose what we do with those feelings." 2 weeks passed in this awful limbo, close enough to see each other but impossibly distant, aware of each other but determinedly separate. Eliza felt herself breaking under the weight of it. She couldn't live like this, suspended between hope and despair, never knowing where she stood or what he truly felt. She needed answers, needed honesty, needed something to either build on or finally let go of. She decided that night, lying sleepless in her bed, that she would confront him. Whatever the cost, she needed the truth, but fate intervened before she could act on her decision. She woke near midnight to find herself unable to sleep, her mind too full of questions and unspoken words. She wrapped herself in her robe and wandered toward the library, knowing James wouldn't be there at this hour, seeking the comfort of books when human comfort seemed impossible to find. But when she pushed open the library door, she found she was wrong. He was there, still fully dressed, sitting in the darkness with only the fire for light, a glass of brandy in his hand, and a nearly empty bottle on the table beside him. He looked up when she entered, and even in the dim light she could see he looked terrible, exhausted, haunted, like a man at the end of his rope. "Eliza," he said, her name rough in his mouth. "What are you doing here?" His words weren't quite slurred, but they carried the weight of however many glasses he'd already consumed. "I couldn't sleep," she said quietly, closing the door behind her. "You?" He laughed, a bitter sound with no humor in it. "I don't sleep anymore. Haven't, not really, since—" He gestured vaguely with his glass. Eliza should have left. This wasn't the time, he wasn't in the right state. Nothing good could come from this conversation. But 2 weeks of silence and confusion and hurt made her bold. "James, what happened?" "We were—" She struggled for words. "We were becoming friends, I thought. Maybe more than friends. And then you just shut me out again. Why?" He drank the rest of his brandy in one swallow and poured another with hands that weren't quite steady. "It's better this way," he said, not looking at her. "Better for whom?" she challenged. "For both of us." "That's not true." He stood abruptly, the movement unsteady, agitation written in every line of his body. "You don't understand." "Then make me understand." Her voice was louder than she'd intended, frustration and hurt finally spilling over. "I'm not a child, James. Don't shut me out and pretend it's for my own good. Tell me the truth." He turned to face her, and the anguish in his expression stopped her breath. "You want the truth?" His voice was raw. "Every time I look at you, I feel things I swore I'd never feel again. Things that terrify me. Elara died, Eliza. The woman I loved died, and it nearly destroyed me." His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I built these walls for a reason. To protect myself. To never feel that kind of pain again. And then you came here with your kindness and your patience and your laugh that makes me remember what joy feels like. And you're dismantling everything I built to keep myself safe." Eliza's heart was pounding. "Safe from what?" she asked, though she already knew. "From caring," he said, his voice breaking. "From letting you matter. Because if I let myself care about you, if I let you become important to me, then I'm vulnerable again. And what if something happens to you? What if I lose you the way I lost Elara? I can't survive that again, Eliza, I can't." She took a step toward him. "So you're choosing to lose me now instead? By pushing me away?" "I'm protecting both of us," he insisted, but his conviction was wavering. "From what? From happiness? From connection? From not being alone?" She took another step closer. "So you're losing me anyway, James. This distance, this cold silence, it's killing what we had." "What did we have?" he asked almost desperately. "A few pleasant conversations. Some shared meals." That's not love," she finished for him, her voice gentle but firm. "Maybe not for you, but for me—" She stopped, realizing she'd said too much, revealed too much. But there was no taking it back now. His eyes locked on hers, and she could see him struggling with hope and fear in equal measure. "For you what?" he demanded. She could retreat, could protect herself, could keep her own walls intact. But she was tired of walls, tired of pretending, tired of both of them being so afraid of living that they were barely alive at all. "For me it became everything," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I came here expecting nothing but survival. A roof over my head, that's all. But you gave me more than that. You gave me companionship and conversation, and moments where I felt alive again. You made me laugh. You made me hope, and somewhere in all of that I fell in love with you, James. Completely, irrevocably." The words hung in the air between them, impossible to take back. James had gone completely still, staring at her as if she'd spoken in a language he didn't quite understand. I know that wasn't the arrangement, Eliza continued, tears beginning to blur her vision but her voice remaining strong. I know you offered shelter, not love. I know I'm probably ruining everything by telling you this, but I can't keep pretending I don't feel this way. It's destroying me from the inside out. Eliza. Her name was barely a whisper, and she couldn't read his expression. Shock, fear, something else she didn't dare name. I'm sorry, she said, wiping at her eyes. I'll go. I just needed you to know. I needed to be honest, even if it changes everything. Even if it means don't, he said sharply, crossing the distance between them in 2 quick strides. His hands came up to frame her face, and his eyes, those storm-grey eyes that had been so empty when she first arrived, were blazing with emotion. Fear, yes, but also longing, desperation, and something that made her breath catch in her throat. Don't apologize, he said roughly. Don't you dare apologize for being brave enough to feel when I'm too much of a coward to admit. He stopped, swallowed hard, his thumbs brushing away the tears on her cheeks. To admit that I love you too. The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. What? She breathed. I love you, he said again, stronger this time. God help me, I've been fighting it for weeks, but I love you, Eliza. And it terrifies me. It absolutely terrifies me. Eliza's hands came up to cover his where they still framed her face, afraid that if she let go, this moment would dissolve like a dream. You love me, she repeated, needing to hear it again, needing to believe it was real. James's forehead dropped to touch hers, his eyes closing as if the admission had cost him everything. I've been so afraid, he whispered, terrified of betraying Ilara's memory, terrified that if I let myself love you, fate would rip you away from me too, terrified that opening my heart again means inviting that same devastating loss. His hands were trembling against her face, so I tried to push you away, tried to rebuild the walls, tried to go back to just existing instead of living. But I can't, Eliza. I can't go back to that emptiness now that I know what it feels like to be near you, to hear you laugh, to watch your face light up when you're reading something that moves you. He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. You've brought me back to life. You've made me remember what it feels like to want something beyond mere survival. To hope, to feel joy. I'm still terrified, he admitted, his voice rough. Terrified something will happen to you, that I'll lose you, that this happiness is temporary. But I'm more terrified of losing you by pushing you away, of never knowing what we could have because I was too afraid to try. Eliza felt her own tears flowing freely now. Nothing is guaranteed, James, not tomorrow, not next year. Ilara's death taught you that, and my father's death taught me the same terrible lesson. Life is fragile and uncertain, she continued. But that's exactly why we can't waste it. Can't waste these moments, these feelings, out of fear. Her voice grew stronger. I could leave this house tomorrow and be struck by a carriage. You could fall ill. The manor could burn. 1,000 things could happen. But right now, in this moment, we're here, together, both of us feeling the same way. Isn't that precious? Isn't that worth the risk? She saw something shift in his expression, some internal battle reaching its conclusion. Ilara wouldn't want this for you, Eliza said softly. Would she? She wouldn't want you hiding from life, from love, because you lost her. James's eyes closed again, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. No, she wouldn't. She loved life, loved fully, lived fearlessly. She'd be furious with me for locking myself away, for half-living, for letting grief turn me into a ghost. He opened his eyes, and they were clear now, resolved. I've been honoring her memory all wrong. Isolating myself isn't tribute, it's cowardice. She deserves better than that. She deserves to be remembered by someone who still lives, who still loves, who honors what we had by choosing life instead of dying slowly. His thumbs brushed across Eliza's cheeks again, wiping away fresh tears. So I'm choosing you. I'm choosing life. I'm choosing to be brave even though I'm still scared. Will you help me? Will you be patient with me when the fear tries to pull me back? Always, Eliza promised. We'll be brave together. We'll face the fear together. You don't have to do this alone anymore, James. That's what I've been trying to tell you. You're not alone. He smiled, then really smiled, and it transformed his entire face. She'd seen hints of it before, small moments when his guard dropped, but this was different. This was joy, genuine and unguarded, and it made him look years younger, made her see the man he'd been before grief had carved lines into his face. Eliza, he said, his voice dropping lower, more intimate. May I kiss you, please? I've wanted to since that night in the dining room when I touched your face. Since before that, if I'm honest. I've wanted to kiss you and been too afraid to try." Her answer was to rise on her toes, closing the small distance between them. "Yes," she breathed. "God, yes." He leaned in slowly, giving her time to change her mind, but she didn't want to. She'd wanted this for weeks, had dreamed of it, had imagined what his lips would feel like against hers. But the reality was so much better than any fantasy. His lips touched hers softly at first, tentative, almost questioning. Then she responded, her hands sliding up to tangle in his hair, pulling him closer, and something broke loose in both of them. The kiss deepened, becoming desperate, urgent. Two people who'd been starving, finally allowed to feast. Years of loneliness and fear and careful control melted away, replaced by heat and need, and the overwhelming relief of finally giving in to what they'd both been fighting. His arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her flush against him, and she made a sound that was half gasp, half sigh. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, his forehead rested against hers again. "I love you," he said again, as if he needed to keep saying it, to make up for all the weeks he'd held the words back. "I love you too," she replied, smiling through her tears. "So much. For so long." The kiss in the library should have been the beginning of their happily ever after. James had finally admitted his feelings, finally broken through the walls he'd built around his heart. They'd stayed up until dawn, talking and kissing and making plans for a real marriage, a real future. When Eliza finally returned to her rooms as the sun rose, her lips were swollen and her heart was full. Everything was going to be different now. Everything was going to be wonderful, but fate, it seemed, had other plans. She'd been asleep for perhaps 2 hours when urgent pounding on her door jolted her awake. Mrs. Holloway's voice, sharp with panic, cut through the fog of exhaustion. "My lady, please wake up. There's a fire." Eliza was out of bed instantly, her heart lurching with fear. "Where?" she demanded, throwing on her robe. "The east wing." Old chimney finally gave out. "It's spreading fast." The corridors were already filling with smoke as Eliza ran toward the commotion. Servants rushed past carrying valuables, shouting instructions to each other, their faces streaked with soot and terror. She found James in the entrance hall, his shirt already blackened, his face grim as he organized the chaos around him. "Everyone out," he was shouting. "Mrs. Holloway, make sure every servant is accounted for. Thomas, get the horses from the stable before the smoke reaches them." Eliza immediately began helping, guiding frightened maids toward the exit, grabbing important ledgers from the study, doing whatever she could to assist in the evacuation. The smoke was getting thicker, the heat more intense, and she could hear the roar of flames consuming the east wing. James was everywhere at once, directing footmen with water buckets, ensuring everyone was safe, his voice steady and commanding despite the crisis. Then she heard Mrs. Holloway cry out, "Jenny? Has anyone seen Jenny?" The young maid, barely 16, had been assigned to clean the upper floor rooms that morning. Eliza's blood ran cold as she realized the girl was still inside. Without thinking, she started toward the burning wing, but James's hand caught her arm. "Not you," he said sharply. "It's too dangerous." She turned to face him, saw the fear in his eyes. "She's just a girl, James. She could be trapped up there." "I'll go," he said firmly. "You stay here. Promise me." But before she could respond, he was already running toward the flames, disappearing into the smoke-filled corridor. Eliza stood frozen, her heart in her throat, watching the doorway where he'd vanished. This was exactly what he'd been afraid of, caring about someone and then losing them. But now he was the one in danger, and she was the one left behind, terrified and helpless. The minutes that followed were the longest of her life. She could hear shouting from inside, the crash of falling timber, the roar of fire consuming everything it touched. The other servants stood in clusters on the lawn, watching in horror as flames licked out of windows, as smoke poured from every opening. Eliza couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only stare at that doorway and pray. She'd just found him. She'd just gotten him to open his heart, to choose life and love. She couldn't lose him now. Not like this. Then finally she saw movement in the smoke. James emerged, coughing violently, carrying Jenny in his arms. The girl was conscious but clearly terrified, clinging to him as he stumbled down the steps. The moment his feet hit the gravel drive, Eliza was running. She reached them just as he was setting Jenny down carefully, other servants rushing forward to help the girl. Eliza threw her arms around James, not caring that he was covered in soot and ash, not caring about anything except that he was alive and solid and there. "You could have died," she said against his chest, her voice breaking. "You could have died and I would have—" She couldn't finish the sentence. He held her tight, his heart pounding against her ear. "But I didn't," he said hoarsely. "We're both safe. Everyone's safe." Behind them, the fire crew from the village had finally arrived and was working to contain the blaze. It took hours, but eventually they managed to save most of the manor, though the east wing was a total loss. As dawn broke properly, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed obscene, given what had just happened, Eliza and James sat exhausted on a garden bench, watching the last of the smoke clear. His arm was around her shoulders, her head resting against him, both of them too tired to move. "That was terrifying," she whispered, "watching you run in there, not knowing if you'd come out." He turned to look at her, his face streaked with soot, but his eyes clear and intense. "Now you know how I felt when you tried to go in." "We could have lost everything tonight," Eliza said. "Not just the house, but each other. It proved something, James. Life is fragile. Any moment could be our last. We can't waste time being afraid." He cupped her face with his dirty hand, not caring about appearances, not caring about anything except the woman in front of him. "You're right. We almost lost everything tonight. Not to grief or fear or guilt, but to actual danger. Real danger. And all I could think, running through those flames, was that I never got to properly show you how much I love you." "What do you mean, properly?" she asked, a small smile playing at her lips despite everything. "Last night was rather convincing." He smiled back, that genuine smile that still took her breath away. "Last night was a beginning, but we were interrupted by exhaustion and dawn. And I want—" he paused, choosing his words carefully. "I want you to move into my chambers, today. No more separate wings, no more distance. I want to wake up with you beside me. I want to fall asleep holding you. I want everything a real marriage should be." Eliza's heart soared. "I want that too. All of it." He leaned forward, his forehead touching hers. We were both covered in soot and smoke, exhausted from fighting the fire, sitting in a garden at dawn while his home still smoldered. But somehow it was perfect, real and honest and exactly what they needed. "No more fear," he said softly. "No more running. No more pretending we don't feel what we feel." "No more walls," she agreed, and then he kissed her. Not tentatively like the first time in the library, not desperately like later that same night, but with a sureness that spoke of commitment and choice and a future they were both finally brave enough to claim. The kiss tasted of smoke and ash and new beginnings. When they finally pulled apart, the sun had fully risen, bathing everything in golden light. A new day, a new start. A real marriage finally beginning. "Come on," James said, standing and pulling her to her feet. "Let's go inside. Together." He kept her hand firmly in his as they walked back toward the manor, past servants who were already beginning to clean up, past the damaged wing that would need to be rebuilt. But the damage didn't matter. The loss didn't matter. They'd survived, and they'd survived together, and that was everything. As they climbed the stairs toward his chambers, their chambers now, Eliza felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her. The Duke had offered her shelter 3 months ago, nothing more. A roof over her head, and a name to protect her. But they'd found something neither had been looking for, something infinitely more valuable than security or comfort. They'd found each other. And that single kiss in the garden, born from crisis and fear and the fierce determination to live fully, had truly changed everything. The days following the fire brought changes that transformed Thornfield Manor from a house into a home. Eliza's belongings were moved into James's chambers that very afternoon, despite her exhaustion and his protests that she should rest first. "No," she'd said firmly. "No more waiting. No more separate lives. We start now." So Mrs. Holloway had supervised the move with barely concealed delight, and by evening Eliza's dresses hung beside James's coats. Her books shared shelves with his, and her hairbrush sat on the vanity next to his shaving kit. Small things, domestic things, but they represented everything. The merging of two lives, the end of loneliness, the beginning of partnership. That first night in their shared chambers felt both momentous and natural. James was nervous, she could tell, his hands trembling slightly as he helped her with the buttons on her dress. "Are you sure?" he asked at the threshold of something neither could take back. "I don't want you to feel pressured. We can wait if—" She silenced him with a kiss. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," she said against his lips. "I love you. I want this. I want you." What followed was tender and awkward and perfect in the way first times often are. There was fumbling and nervous laughter, and whispered reassurances. But there was also passion and connection, and a sense of coming home that neither had expected. Afterward, lying tangled together in the darkness, James's arms wrapped around her as if he'd never let go. Eliza felt tears slip down her cheeks. "What's wrong?" he asked, immediately concerned. "Nothing," she said, and it was true. "Everything is so right it overwhelms me. I didn't think I'd ever have this. Someone to hold me. Someone who loves me. A real home." He kissed her temple, her cheek, her lips. "I didn't think I'd have it again," he admitted. "Didn't think I deserved it. Didn't think my broken heart could be whole enough to offer anyone." He pulled back to look at her in the moonlight, streaming through the windows. "But you made me whole again, Eliza. You were patient when I was cold, kind when I was cruel, brave when I was a coward. You saved me." She shook her head. "We saved each other. That's what love does. It doesn't rescue, it partners. It doesn't fix, it supports. We're healing together, James, and we'll keep healing every day for the rest of our lives." Morning came with sunlight flooding their room and the novel experience of waking in each other's arms. James woke first and spent long minutes just watching her sleep, marveling at the peaceful expression on her face, at the trust it took to be so vulnerable beside him. When her eyes finally fluttered open and found him watching, she smiled. "Good morning, husband," she said, the word carrying new weight, new meaning. "Good morning, wife," he replied, and kissed her thoroughly. They took breakfast in their chambers, neither ready to face the world yet, wanting to preserve this bubble of intimacy and happiness for just a little longer. James hand-fed her strawberries, and she laughed when juice dripped down his chin and she had to wipe it away. They talked about everything and nothing. Plans for rebuilding the East Wing, books they wanted to read together, whether they should get a dog. Ordinary conversations made extraordinary by the sheer joy of having them together, as partners, as lovers, as husband and wife in truth as well as law. The manor itself seemed to respond to their happiness. Mrs. Holloway went about her duties humming, something she hadn't done in years. The other servants moved with lighter steps, speaking in normal voices instead of hushed whispers. Orders were given to open rooms that had been closed since Ilara's death, to remove the Holland covers from furniture, to let light and air circulate through spaces that had languished in darkness. James personally oversaw the opening of the music room, a chamber that had been Ilara's favorite, and when Eliza hesitated at the threshold, unsure if he was ready for this, he took her hand. "She loved music," he said. "She'd want this room to be used to bring joy again. She wouldn't want it to be a shrine to grief." Eliza proved to have a talent for piano, and soon the manor echoed with music again. James would work at his desk while she played, and sometimes he'd pause in his correspondence just to listen, a smile playing at his lips. The tenants noticed the change in their Duke when he rode out to visit them. He was warmer, more engaged, actually laughed at their jokes instead of offering polite half-smiles. Word spread through the county that the Duke of Howard had finally emerged from his mourning, that his marriage had transformed him, that love had worked a miracle at the old manor. They hosted their first dinner party 6 weeks after the fire, inviting neighbouring families who'd long since given up on receiving social invitations from Thornfield. The guests arrived curious and left amazed, whispering about how devoted the Duke and Duchess clearly were, how they looked at each other with such warmth, how the Duke actually smiled and laughed, like a man who remembered how to be happy. An old friend of James's, a baron who'd known him since childhood, pulled him aside late in the evening. "James, I haven't seen you like this since—" "Well, ever, really. Even before Ilara died, you weren't this settled, this content. Whatever you found with Eliza, hold on to it. It's rare and precious." The rebuilding of the East Wing became a symbol of their own reconstruction. James consulted Eliza on every decision. The new windows she suggested would let in more light, the brighter paint colors that would make the rooms feel less oppressive, the updated chimney system that would prevent future disasters. They worked on the plans together in the evenings, heads bent over architectural drawings, debating the merits of various designs. It was partnership in its truest form, neither dominating, both contributing, creating something better together than either could have managed alone. 3 months after their night in the library, James took Eliza to the cemetery. It was her first time visiting Ilara's grave, and she was nervous, unsure if this was appropriate, if the past and present should intersect this way. But James held her hand firmly as they walked through the iron gates. The grave was well tended, fresh flowers already in place. James still sent them weekly, though he no longer came himself as often. "Ilara," he said aloud, his voice steady, "I want you to meet Eliza, my wife, the woman I love." Eliza felt tears prick her eyes as he continued. "I'll always be grateful for what we had. You taught me how to love, how to be open, how to find joy in small things. Those lessons didn't die with you. They were gifts I carried forward." His hand tightened on Eliza's. "But I'm living now, Ilara, really living, not just going through motions. I'm choosing happiness. I'm choosing love. I'm choosing a future instead of dwelling in the past. And I think I know you'd want that for me." He was quiet for a moment, and Eliza could feel the weight of what he was doing, the significance of this goodbye. "Thank you," he said finally, "for everything, for loving me, for being patient with a young man who didn't always know how to love you back properly, for teaching me that life is precious and should be lived fully. I hope you're at peace. I hope you're happy. And I hope you know that letting you go doesn't mean forgetting you. It just means I'm finally ready to stop dying alongside you." They stood there together for several more minutes, Eliza's head resting on his shoulder, before James finally nodded once and turned away. He didn't look back. Eliza understood. This was closure, real and final and necessary. The past would always be part of him, but it no longer controlled him. He was free. 6 months after that first kiss in the library, Eliza realized her monthly courses hadn't come. At first she thought it was stress or the lingering effects of the fire's trauma, but when another week passed and then another, hope began to flutter in her chest. She waited until she was certain, until the doctor she'd quietly consulted confirmed her suspicions, before telling James. That evening, sitting in their chambers before the fire, she took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "James," she said softly, "we're going to have a baby." He went absolutely still, his eyes wide with shock. "A baby?" he repeated, as if he couldn't quite process the words. "We're—" She nodded, smiling through sudden tears. "I'm pregnant. We're going to be parents." The expression that crossed his face was so complex it took her breath away. Joy and terror and wonder and love all swirling together. "The baby," he said again, and then his eyes filled with tears. "Life, new life. After so much death and grief and loss, life." He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, and she felt his shoulders shake with emotion. "I'm terrified," he admitted against her hair. "What if something goes wrong? What if I can't protect you? What if—" "We'll face it together," she interrupted gently. The same words she'd spoken months ago during that storm. "Whatever comes, whatever fears we have, we face them together. You're not alone in this, James. You'll never be alone again." He pulled back to cup her face in his hands, and his smile, through his tears, was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. "Thank you," he whispered, "for not giving up on me, for loving me when I was convinced I was unlovable, for being patient while I learned how to live again, for giving me everything I thought I'd lost forever. Love, hope, a future, and now this, a child, a family." He kissed her then, soft and reverent, one hand moving back to rest protectively over their child. That night, as they lay together in the darkness, James's hand never left her stomach, as if he could protect them both through sheer force of will. "I love you," he murmured. "Both of you. So much it frightens me. But it's a good fear now, the kind that comes from having something precious to lose, something worth being afraid for." Eliza laced her fingers through his. "The Duke promised me shelter," she said quietly, echoing the words that had brought them together. "Nothing more. A roof over my head and a name to use. But we built something so much greater than that. A home," James agreed. "A real home. Not just a building, but a feeling. A place where two broken people found each other and somehow made something whole." He shifted to kiss her forehead, her cheek, her lips. "You're my home, Eliza. Wherever you are, that's where I belong. That's where I'm whole. That's where I'm finally truly alive. Outside their window, stars blazed in a clear autumn sky. The same stars that had witnessed so much grief and loss, now bearing witness to joy and new beginnings. The manor stood solid around them, scarred by fire but stronger for it, just like its master. And inside those ancient walls, in a bed where a man had once slept alone and hollow, two people held each other close and dreamed of the future they'd build together. A future neither had dared hope for. But both had been brave enough to claim. The Duke had offered shelter, nothing more. But love, as it always does, had transformed that simple offering into something miraculous. A second chance. A new beginning. A forever that neither would take for granted, because they knew too well how precious, how fragile, and how absolutely worth fighting for such happiness truly was.